looking at what can be done locally to improve the trade deficit that plagues our country for many of the health products. But let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So good afternoon. This is Shams Yazdani. I'm a group leader of Microbial Engineering Group at ICGB New Delhi, International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology, who is one of the sponsor of this event, and I'm thoroughly enjoying the whole of the event. So I'm also a coordinator of government-funded, what we call it as a DBT ICGB, Center for Advanced Bioenergy Research, and that's where my root of biofuels come into the picture. I'm also coordinator of what is called Mission Innovation India Unit. So this is an international program where there are 32 countries joined together to work on the clean energy area so that we can achieve the promise that we made in the Paris Convention. So overall, my field is tackling the climate change while working on the biofuels. So looking forward to have an interaction. Thank you very much.
And I think you had a short presentation. We'll hand it you. Yeah, so we'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Once again, good afternoon, colleagues. So to provide a background, I'd like to locate the discussion within a macroeconomic framework of our country.
Recording in progress.
So we've often heard from commentators in the mainstream media talking about the fiscal cliff. And by that, amongst other things, is that our debt to GDP ratio is quite high. And as a result of the rating agencies downgrading us often, we spend a lot of money servicing our debt. So that being the one issue. My colleague from DTIC now just made mention of the fact that we have an ever-growing trade deficit. So that's amongst the issues also from a microeconomic perspective that are a challenge to South Africa. And I think we are also aware that for the first time in 13 years, and inflation is outside the target of the Reserve Bank. I believe it was at 7.3% or so. So we have lots of those challenges. Amongst them, it's what the World Bank, in one of the researches that they conducted about on our economy, they said we are plagued with a triple challenge. And they define that by saying we are grappling with issues related to poverty, issues related to inequality. I don't have to mention that we are the most unequal society in the world. And as well as issues related to unemployment. We also are aware that quite recently, our unemployment rate has gone skyrocketing. So with those macroeconomic features, we also know that our economy is, there's what they call a commodity grip. And by that essentially refers to a fact that when you look at our GDP, a biggest portion of our GDP contribution comes from mining. So we are reliant on commodities. And economies of the 21st century that are successful are diversified. So we have that challenge in South Africa that our eggs are pretty much in one basket if you look at the contribution of various sectors to our economy. So with that background as a macroeconomic framework of the country, what you have here on the screen is what the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition in 2018 sought to establish whether or not there's a business case for biopharmaceutical manufacturing in South Africa. And so they went out on public tender to request to conduct an analysis and develop a biopharmaceutical sector plan for South Africa. So this is the background. Upon its conceptualization, this was meant to be this was meant to be a sector development plan that in the event that upon conclusion of the study, it is found that there's a business case for biopharmaceutical manufacturing, then this particular study will then be the driver that is used to operate all different levers towards biopharmaceutical manufacturing. The current administration, I believe, that is the 6th administration. There was change of guard at the DTIC, hence the C from DTI. That came with a change of approach wherein the master plans, which my colleague will talk about, became became an approach that undergirdis everything that DTIC does. So as we speak, this will no longer be a standalone plan, but it will be a plan that slots into the overall master plan of health, and Swasti will talk quite a bit about it. So that is the background to what we're going to be talking about. It's about biopharmaceutical manufacturing in South Africa, whether or not there's a business case to do so. So I will take you through a few issues out of this particular. So this is exactly an RFP that went out. I want to talk from it to give you a sense of what were the issues, and I want to take you to a problem statement. I'm going to ask tech support if you can zoom a little bit. I want to focus on section 4. If you can maybe just enlarge it. Thank you, and just section 4. Thank you so much. So, colleagues, I can read it very quickly. The South African pharmaceutical industry is characterized by imports. Of course, we just spoke about the trade deficit. Furthermore, the high cost of injectables and biologic drugs have prevented many in South Africa public from accessing these important medicines. The private sector accounted for 86.7% of the market. The public sector accounted for 13.3% of the market. In addition, biopharmaceutical and other life sciences discoveries made in South Africa are typically developed in other countries with little residual value kept in South Africa due to the lack of a vibrant life sciences or biopharmaceutical infrastructure in South Africa. The Industrial Development Division has identified the lack of a sector development plan with specific focus on biopharmaceutical manufacture, potential and related R&D and clinical trial opportunities. So if you just look at this particular problem statement and you deconstruct it, you come across at least 4 features. Amongst them is the issue of trade deficit as it pertains to imports that are flooding the market. There's an issue of protection of intellectual property rights in that some of the innovations that emanate from our country are then developed elsewhere with little residual value to the country. And the third issue that's mentioned here is an issue of access to care, access to medicines. And of course, there's also a question of the knowledge economy, as I referred to macroeconomic features of our country and spoke about diversification. It is important that we diversify, and amongst some of the things that we can do to diversify our economy is to venture off into sectors such as biopharmaceutical manufacturing. So those are the things that you pick up, but I do want to highlight two issues. That you pick up trade issues and you also pick up health issues. I will talk to this point at a later stage. I just wanted to highlight it, and also just to make mention of a fact that just from a problem statement, what you also pick up is a question of sustainable development goals. The Sustainable Development Goal number 3 that talks about well-being and health, it comes out in the problem statement. There's a Sustainable Development Goal number 8 that talks about infrastructure and innovation. And of course, there's Sustainable Development Goal number 17 that talks about partnerships. So all of those you will find as we go along that they feature here. So what am I saying? I'm saying at a global level, this particular problem statement slots into a model that has been put forward for advancing how we develop our global landscape in a sustainable manner. So that's the first framework that presents itself and jumps out of the problem statement. So just to also very quickly go through what were the objectives of the study. It was amongst them, it was to do a critical review of current policy and initiatives undertaken in support of this industry. So that was to look at what has been done before. A plan to develop the biopharmaceutical sector over the short term, so 2 plans were required, a 5-year term as well as a 10-year term. Determine the ecosystem required to build a successful biopharmaceutical industry. So how different sectors will need to be in existence and operate in tandem to support biopharmaceutical manufacturing. 3 last objectives were to develop a database of companies across different tiers in this space and define a framework for appropriately engaging and aligning public and private industry. And this is the issue about SDGs number 17, that collaborations and partnerships are important. What this particular objective speaks to is the fact that there are a number of organizations, companies, doing a number of things, everybody elsewhere, without it being clear whether we actually have an ecosystem that we can then just harness and and get it to operate in tandem. So it was to establish who's out there doing what. Engage with a select group of relevant biopharmaceutical and biosimilar manufacturers. Define a funding model and support package to support the execution of the plan. So those were the objectives at inception. So in the interest of time, I will just outline how did this unfold, and tech support, I'm gonna, okay, I can drive my own presentation. All right, so this was supposed to unfold over 4 phases. Perhaps at this point I must mention that, of course, there was an RFP, and there was an organization, a company called Kiara Health, that was successful in bidding for this particular project. At the time, I was with Kiara Health. I was a project leader for the study, but I am providing feedback at the request of the DTIC and Africa Bio, just so that I clarify that. So the study did take place around the 4 phases, spanning review of current sector policies, strategies, and activities. So this was a desktop exercise of literature review. And then what happened next was, in phase 2, was to look at the value chain analysis and where the priorities ought to be. The 3rd phase was to do a comprehensive analysis and benchmarking of policies for each of the priorities. So this was by way of looking at successful countries abroad and those that present with economic features that somewhat do have common features with South Africa, so that we could potentially replicate their successes. And of course, the last phase was the development and deployment of the DTI's new policy sector plan to support sustainable industry development in South Africa. So this was actually the plan that needed to be developed. So with that said, as a background, having looked at the objectives, having looked at the problem statement, as well as how did this unfold, I present to you what came out in 2 slides as I conclude. The one thing that was quite palpable and apparent was the fact that this tension between trade and health line ministries. So if you look at the health department, it is their priority to have a product on the shelf. The cheapest, the better, as long as quality, safety, and efficacy is not in question. And my friend on my right-hand side is interested in making sure that that product is manufactured in South Africa for the macroeconomic issues that we started off by talking about, to arrest issues related to trade deficit, and so on and so forth. So the tension between health and trade was quite apparent and palpable. So that's the first issue that I will mention. So what transpired is that in some of the countries where they were quite successful, there was an approach where they had a super ministry. I'll make a mention of Russia. So to overcome challenges such as trade and health not working together, because inherently, this is not the issue only in South Africa. It's something that happens throughout the world, and World Health Organization did a study on this. So to overcome that, you find that there's a super ministry that then pulls everything together. So in this case, a joint steering committee was proposed. And Chair, I'm concluding. That will cut across various sectors, both in the private sector and in terms of the state parties. So the plan comprises, as I already said, that there was to be a short-term plan that was for 5 years, as well as a long-term plan that was for 10 years. So 25 actions were identified for both short-term plan and long-term plan. For short-term, in the 5 years, 14 actions were identified as needed to be done. Well, of course, if you look at the table that is in front of us, you will notice that the start dates starts as early as Q2 2021. Of course, there was COVID that happened, and there was, as I said, the change of guard that came with certain changes. So a master plan process got in place, and then this particular plan now needs to slot into the master plan. So, but basically, there were 14 short-term actions as well as 11 long-term actions. 5 emerging themes came up as far as the short-term plan is concerned. I will not go into details about them. I will just, at high level, state that it was found that it is important that there be a creation of institutional framework for growth of the local industry. So that ought to be institutionalized so that we don't talk about it as nice notions, but it can actually become imperatives. There are 3 actions in terms of how that can be embedded. So the issue of human capital I mean, we spoke about the fact that the biopharmaceutical sector is a knowledge economy. It's important that the human capital be looked at because this sector consumes quite high-end sophisticated skills. So there are three action items to deal with that. There's also a question of strategic collaboration in procurement. If you think, okay, so I did mention that we did benchmarking. Part of benchmarking was also to look at what Ethiopia is doing as a first country in Africa to develop a pharmaceutical sector plan on how to grow their pharmaceutical industry. So for instance, they have what they call pool procurement of raw materials. So let's make an example, paracetamol. So the state will procure paracetamol and use economies of scale to get good discounts. And the companies that needs to use paracetamol in the country will procure from the state. And so they procure at far lesser cost than they would have if they place their own individual orders with suppliers abroad. So that was one of the things that came up. There was an issue about pharmaceutical intelligence. There are two actions as far as that is concerned. I think I should just talk to the first point. There's implementation of a track and trace marker technology at customs level to inform decisions related to import substitution. Of course, there are points I did not touch on prior to this, but there was a finding through the three phases that were conducted that said that it is important that local production be protected from imports. So type of a policy on how to do that within the World Trade Organization allows. So what this particular action talks to is we need to know exactly what is coming into the country. And to that end, be able to stop that which we have locally, grow our own timber, basically. And then fifthly and lastly, in terms of the short plan, it was a utilization of available policy instruments. Because as I said, in the first phase, it was a literature review of all the policies spanning multiple line ministries in terms of what is available as policies and as policy instruments. And what was clear as an outcome of that particular exercise was that, in fact, all the policies, all the instruments that are required are in place. We are just not using them, or we are using them in silos and they somehow negate each other. As I conclude, the long-term plan for growing the biopharmaceutical industry in South Africa. As I said, there are 11 actions for this. Investment promotion. I think if you look at the first issue, talks about domestic import protection, which is what I spoke about just now. There are 6 actions related to this, and it is important that there be a creation of an enabling environment for local production. And then export facilitation, and this is where the DTIC comes in terms of making sure that locally produced products can be exported to other markets. And in that way, again, we're going to curb the growing trade deficit. Lastly, it was an issue of government, institutions, and regulatory framework. So you find that, for instance, something that was the DG of DSI, Dr. Mchawaka, spoke about yesterday, is how we need to ramp up clinical trials as part of the knowledge economy, of course. But what you then find is that another department of government that deals with exports, permits, export and import permits becomes a bottleneck in terms of facilitating this. So this was about having all government agencies and line ministries operating seamlessly together to be able to do this. So in conclusion, it was found that there is a business case for biopharmaceutical manufacturing in South Africa. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Godfrey. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you flight the presentation, please? So the buzzword at this conference and convention has been partnerships. And so in essence, what we are talking about today, the master plans, in a way tries to cement what partnerships should mean and what should deliver on for the benefit of the country. So I'll just briefly present on what we're trying to do with master plans as the DTIC. One of the key pillars of the reimagined industrial strategy was to really cement the state's role in terms of changing the growth trajectory of South Africa. And one of the key pillars was the master planning process. And the reason why the state looked at the master plans is it wanted to sort of replicate what had been successes that were achieved through the automotive master planning process. You may not know, or you may not know, the automotive sector is an example of a true success. It's 20 years in the making, but we've attracted investments by the largest OEMs in the world, manufacturing a whole range of vehicles in the country. They've localized parts, different components. An example is Toyota in the south of Durban, who have localized more than 600 different parts. They've invested huge sums of money in the order of billions in localizing in South Africa and are currently exporting. So the entire automotive sector as a whole are probably exporting in the order of hundreds of billions of rands. Which is a great success story, and obviously promotes economic growth for the country. Over the last decade, South Africa has unfortunately experienced massive deindustrialization. Our manufacturing GDP declined from 13.9% to 11.7% from 2010 to 2020. And obviously we need to turn the tide on this, and so through the RIS and through other policies of government, the master planning process has become one of the key tools in which we can try and revitalize the manufacturing sectors across a number of different sectors. Just to also emphasize that while DTIC plays a significant role in a number of master plans, it's not entirely a DTIC run process. In some of the sectors, like in agriculture, in cannabis, other departments are leading. So this is just an example of what had been agreed upon, and as you can see, DTIC's role is really around how do we increase localization for reindustrialization, how do we reduce the trade deficit that is predominant in many of the sectors that we're involved in. And how do we stimulate economic growth and sustain investments in the country, along with other key factors that need to be looked at and objectives to be achieved. So as I said, master planning is one of the tools among a number of different tools in our policy toolbox that is used on a daily basis by a number of different sectors to try and stimulate, sustain, and retain investments in the country. And the master plan, the nice thing about the master plan is that the fact that it's a cross-cutting tool, whereas the other tools are very looking at specific areas. This brings together a number of different players into the space and does what our minister seeks to achieve. Specifically is, and the buzzword being partnership, but reciprocal commitments in South Africa. So, we bring together a number of different stakeholders, looking at a common goal, but cemented in the fact that we all bring something to the table. So we would then look at what kind of commitments would need to be made upfront. Whereas, with the strategies, your commitments tend to be made later. This cements the fact that the commitments need to be made upfront. I talked a little bit about Toyota, but then there are other examples where master plans have been able to obtain at the onset commitments around investments into the country. And you'll find that there are a number of them with significant investments in local manufacture, job creation in the country. So I won't go through all of it, but because we're talking about master planning today. And then basically what we're trying to build on, so the health products master plan was originally not a DTIC-led plan. In fact, Cabinet wanted Department of Health to lead, but because of the pandemic, Minister Patel basically said he would champion the development of the master plan. And so we brought together a number of different stakeholders with a focus on the master plan in this phase, looking really at medical devices. The feeling is that we had, over the last 2 years with the pandemic, let me just also premise this by saying that this is not a positive spin on anything. The South African economy has lots of issues to deal with. But the reality is, through the master planning, through bringing stakeholders together and cementing a partnership, during the height of the pandemic, we were able to, in a very short space of time, develop and manufacture a number of different items that were what we call COVID essentials. And we talked a lot about vaccines, biologics during this conference, but the first port of call during the pandemic was really items that were needed to prevent and diagnose, the COVID-19 virus. So this is why we said that let's focus on those. Let's look at what we built during the pandemic, and then build on that by bringing together a number of different people, stakeholders, and looking at the whole range of things that could be repurposed, or we could produce families of items on. So this is what we are basically doing at the moment. We are seeking to develop or further develop the medical device manufacturing capabilities. South Africa has great capabilities in engineering, plastics extrusion, metal fabrication. These are all items that are required for medical device manufacture. During the height of the pandemic, we were able to, in a matter of months, produce medical consumables. Many of the PPE that was required was produced in South Africa, to the extent where the value chains, the starting materials and the input materials that go into the manufacture of the PPE, the non-wovens, were also manufactured in South Africa, because we were unfortunately reliant on imports of the non-wovens. So we are currently manufacturing non-wovens that go into the PPE. We were able to manufacture sanitizers and disinfectants, which we, because of the overproduction, were able to export across the world. Diagnostics, there was a program with the MI003 and the DSI to import, to fund development and manufacture of diagnostics. You would know about the vaccines with the partnerships between BioVac and Aspen. There's a whole range of medical devices that accompany vaccines or required for vaccine rollout. And that's what we are looking at manufacturing. And then there's the National Ventilator Program. I don't speak a lot about the National Ventilator Program because it was a short-term program really around responding to the need for vaccines. But we were able to produce very basic CPAP devices, about 20,000, I think through the CSR about 18,000, and through SafeP, about 2,000 of the ventilators were produced. And they were rolled out to the public sector. They were funded by the Solidarity Fund, but the problem, again, with what we've seen with vaccines is because demand has dropped, there isn't any further demand or uptake of these ventilators in South Africa. So, we need to look at then how to build sustainability, how do we increase competitiveness, and how do we enable exports of these products into other markets. It also looks at existing mining capabilities because, again, South Africa did not have capability to produce some of the PPE, but the mines did. And it meant bringing some of the mining companies and their capabilities into the fore and working together around producing these PPE that were required for the hospital settings. As mentioned also, the automotive component manufacturers were brought together to manufacture the CPAP devices, the ventilators. And South Africa, again, also through our state-owned entities, and sometimes we use state-owned entities as a swear word, but the reality is that there is quite incredible engineering capabilities residing in these organizations that we could tap into. And then lastly is the issue around the textiles. We have quite a robust and growing textiles industry that is heavily supported and protected in South Africa, and many of the technical textiles used in the country emanate from the manufacture of, from these manufacturers, but we need to obviously then upgrade and move towards advanced wound dressing and other types of textiles that are more sophisticated. So on the right-hand side, you will see then just some of the principles of the master plan. I won't go through all of them. I think we've mentioned, I think the key thing is really around how do we cement that partnership between the different stakeholders. We've brought industry, we've brought government, we've brought academia, we've brought labor together. How do we now cement that into reciprocal commitments to address the areas where interventions are required and to then capitalize on opportunities and build on what has been developed previously. And then the focus areas, for the master plan at the moment, as I said, it's medical devices now, building on to vaccines and biopharmaceuticals later in obviously collaboration with the DSI and other government departments. And then the focus areas, some of the master plans have focused purely on demand side and supply side interventions. We've decided to look at a range of issues around the market. We've heard the issue around procurement commitments or advanced market commitments. We understand there's a need for that to ensure that we have the longer term commitment and investments into the country. There's an issue around skills and capacity development. And there's a need for retaining these skills specifically in South Africa and looking at programs around that. We recognize that medical devices as well do form part of global value chains, and South Africa can become a player in a global value chain or become the end player in a value chain. And then the issue around global competitiveness, because unfortunately, sometimes we do tend to be slightly more expensive than an imported product that's produced locally. So, the issues around how do we become more globally competitive, how do we break market concentrations across the world, how do we tap into regional opportunities on the continent, and what would be needed to make us globally competitive. And then it's the enabling ecosystem, which really focuses on things like funding and regulatory and other issues to ensure that we have this robust ecosystem that medical device companies are able to either develop a product or set up manufacture and sustain themselves and are able to then export products. And so this just a slide that's taken from one of our quarterly reports, just highlighting, some of the areas where we have developed capability and how much of capacity has been developed in South Africa. It does not include the ventilators because of the issues around the ventilator project. It was a very short-term project, and it does not include the medical devices, the diagnostics in this one. And so it's just basically what we're trying to do with the master plans is really trying to increase our industrial output. The trade deficit is a massive issue, especially with pharmaceuticals and medical devices. There's a need to save jobs and increase exports and maintain and grow the level of employment in South Africa. We'll continue as the department focusing on, how do we support local manufacturers to increase their local capacity, both SME and what we call lead large dynamic companies, and in order to not just increase their capacity, but to diversify their outputs as well. And then, really around how do we stabilize and revitalize the manufacturing sector and the economy as a whole. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues, for sharing with us these important policy documents on industrial, on promoting industrialization in the country, especially in the area of the health products. Now we actually shift from health products to the energy sector. Which obviously its importance is of high strategic importance as well. It also has high national security considerations that are implicit. But at the same time, it's one of those we forget, maybe less to forget, it's also to a large extent driven by biotechnology. All the way, if we talk about biofuels, all the way from the selection of the type of plants that you use, the biotechnology tools can obviously play a role there, as well as the enzymes that are used during the processing there. But another reason why I think it's particularly relevant in our context, when we talk about these trade deficits and economic, stimulation, is that it's also been seen as a potential opportunity to drive rural development, because this is where the highest unemployment rates are, and because biofuels require land, etc., this is often seen as a possible opportunity to help with that, even though in terms of how successful that is, that's another story. So we are pleased to actually have with us here our colleague all the way from India to actually talk to us about biofuels for industrializations, and maybe we can learn some lessons in terms of what is being done there that we could apply in our regions.
Thank you very much. Sorry for a nice background giving. So I'm going to give you a larger overview of the issue that world is facing, and in particular, I'll focus on India and touch upon the South Africa a little bit, because this conference I'm attending is in the South Africa. And I'll tell you with the example of India, how India is moving ahead in this direction. So just to give you a little concern to all of, especially the younger generation and the generation like us and the older generation, that what are we giving to this world and what are we giving to the next generation. It's awful that we are actually emitting 35 billion ton of carbon dioxide every year in our environment. And it's 3/4 of which is coming from fossil fuels. So most of them which is emitting in the environment is coming from the fossil fuels. If you see the graph on the right side, although the China and USA perhaps is the highest emitter, but the country like India and South Africa is also lined up probably in the next in the line. So they are not too far away from, especially when considering the growing economy we are in terms of emitting or contributing to this carbon dioxide emission. Now, what is this carbon dioxide emission going to do? It is not just simply saying that we are actually adding carbon dioxide in the environment, but this addition is going to have a huge impact overall. Not only that temperature rises, we have a rise in the ocean, we have a drop in the mountain, the iceberg and all that is going to have, we have air pollution and allergy, and it's so much related to the health. In fact, this slide which I have taken from CDC Atlanta, it suggests that how much we are all interrelated. It's not different. When we are talking about health, we have to talk about climate change as well. Precaution is better than cure is what we say. If we are alert today, we will be able to sort out a lot of problems of tomorrow. And in fact, today's, the vector ecology and the new diseases that are coming, you never know that they are coming out of the climate change that we are facing up. You're already seeing the differences in the climates that are happening. At one places there are floods, other places there are droughts, those places which never had such a high heat, we are having a heat reaching to something very unusual. So these are all concerns that we need to, in particular, every citizen of this world has to take care of. Now, in particular, if you look at India, we have an additional problem is that we are, as a very fast-growing economy, we consume a lot of energy. We need energy, so we consume energy. But we don't produce energy that much, So almost 86% of our energy need is imported from outside. So we are largely dependent upon foreign countries on our, fulfilling our energy need. But I was just looking at the statistics of South Africa. It's not too good a situation here as well. You also import 65% of your energy need from outside. I think it is very important that we look at those figures and we try to see how, while we are trying to deal with the climate change, we also try to become self-sufficient. As the convener was saying, that we need to have this trade deficit, which is coming. We need to, fulfill that. We need to fill the gap. And these are the actions that we can do in our country to fulfill that gap, to fill up that gap. So biofuel is one such solution where not only that you can produce the clean fuel, you don't add up extra carbon dioxide, you don't add up to that 35 billion carbon dioxide, ton of carbon dioxide that currently is being added, but also we are actually becoming a self-sufficient. So the dual goal we are trying to solve from the production of biofuels. Well, there are different generations of biofuels. So first generation, second generation, third generation. First generation is mainly the biofuels that are produced from the food part of the plant, which is either edible part, starch or sugars, which are commonly available now in the market at many countries, especially USA and Brazil. They lead because they have a surplus of the food and they can use that for production of biofuels. However, a country like India, we believe that we shouldn't use the food portion. Rather, we should work on the non-edible part of the biomass, which we call it as a second generation biofuel. And I'll take you through a bit because India believes that we have a 1.3 billion people to be fed. And I think that kind of concern also exists in South Africa. And therefore, can we work on the non-edible part where still the land is there, but that land is not used for that part of the plant is not used for feeding the people, but rather it is going as a waste. And India is working quite a bit on using this generation as a successful generation for making a biofuel. We also have a third generation because it is believed that eventually land will become limiting and we may have to go towards the marine sources like marine algae to fulfill the future need of the fuels. So India made a policy, and in fact, it becomes a very good example to follow. I mean, unless the government is very, very interested to drive these kind of things, as my convener was saying, that whether we see if we become successful or not, it's an intention that has to come, right from the top, that they are interested in fulfilling this goal. They are interested in fulfilling the promise that was made in the Paris Convention. They are fulfilling, they are serious to become self-sufficient in energy. And therefore, they made a goal that they will be, I don't know, you won't see that, but by 2030, we want to blend 20% of the fuel with ethanol. So we will replace 20% of our import that we are doing with the indigenously produced ethanol, and by 2030. And just last month, the government announced that we already achieved 10% of the blending. So when this was announced, it was like 3 to 5% of the blending in 2018. Now we have already announced that we have achieved 10% of blending of fuel with ethanol. And with this success, government says, why wait for 2030? Can we prepone it? Now, can we blend 20% ethanol by 2025 itself? So now they are trying to see a different mechanism where they can support the private and the public sector and the academia and the industries to join together to make it possible so that they can have a 20% blending by 2025, which is just 3 years around. And in the middle section and the later parts, basically there are, the policies suggest that what are the different second generation, the third generation biofuels or feedstocks that can be used. What can the incentive be given, because the companies or industries believe there's a lot of capital cost investment that will come up in building up those plants. Government says, we are willing to support you. We are willing to support you in terms of building that factory, building the infrastructure for making the second generation biofuels possible. Now, India, being a major agricultural country, it produces a large, it's like the biomass, which is basically a non-food portion, non-edible portion of the plant, is a hugely produced 500 million tons. Almost, 2/3 of that is not utilized properly. They're almost waste. And you can see on the bottom, they are most of the time even burned, which adds to the pollution issue. So therefore, these are the feedstock that are being incentivized to be used as a biofuels. And what is the government doing is they have announced that they will set up a 12 second generation biorefineries. We call that as a second generation. And they have committed a $2 billion in setting up those biorefineries, which are going to come in 4-5 years. But 4 commercial plant has already been, in the process of build-up, and probably in the end of this year, it will become functional. They will be producing 10,000 liter of ethanol per day. So all of these, plan has to go. The target has to be planned beforehand so that we can visualize the promise that we make. So, okay, I'll just quickly go through the path that is being followed for producing second generation biofuel. So you can see it from this flow is that the lignocellulosic biomass, which is composed of lignin, cellulose, and hemicellulose, if you do a slight thermochemical pretreatment, you can get rid of the lignin, and then the cellulose and hemicellulose are polymer of sugar. So we can identify enzymes which are really very expensive at this moment. And you can see that for every plant of 10,000 liters per day, you will need 4 to 6 tons of enzymes per day. It's a huge amount of enzyme for every plant that is needed. And therefore, there's a lot of effort that these enzymes are produced indigenously instead of importing from outside. And that's what we are doing at ICGB. We're also working on the second last and last plant where the lignocellulosic biomass will also have, in addition to glucose, xylose, which is C5 sugar, not really fermented very well by traditional yeast. So we do genetic engineering to make these possible. And we also produce long chain alkane, which are more energy dense. So these are just some of the research slides. I'm going to skip because of the time, but basically we have a very nicely funded infrastructure to identify, to screen, to do the bioprospecting, and find out the new enzymes that are produced by the microbes. And we also compare with the best enzyme that are available. In fact, the enzyme market is not really a lot of, it's basically a monopoly in the enzyme market. It's only one player, international player, which sells enzyme. So we compare our enzymes with that enzyme, and we prove that it is better than that enzyme. And, and that comes out by a lot of engineering, genome editing effort that slowly increase the efficiency and the titer of enzymes, because it has to be in a very, very cost-effective manner. And we do a lot of work in a collaborative fashion on sugarcane bagasse. So you can see that there's a factory in India. It's called Natam Sugar Mill near Hyderabad. There's a surplus of bagasse that are present outside on the lower left side. If you see, they don't know what to do with that bagasse. It's just a waste for them, and there's too much of surplus. So we have we had a joint project in the UK where we have used our enzymes to find a solution for their bagasse. We converted into the sugar, and in that case, it was sugar being fermented to citric acid. So success of this enzyme made us to convince government to support us to scale up the enzyme technology, and with the support of government, we are able to scale it up to 15,000 liters scale very, very successfully. And now we have opened a call for expression of interest from companies to come forward and take this further for commercialization. Techno-economic analysis is very important when we are talking about fuels, because it's a high volume, low value product, and therefore the cost has to be very, very competitive, and we have to always look at the cost of the fuels that are in the market. So these are a couple of slides for the beyond enzymes, those C5, C6 fermenting strain that we have engineered, the butanol, which are some of the other fuel molecules, which are extremely important and much more energy dense, because you can not only blend it, but you can simply add it into the engine without any problem, because ethanol, you can blend it only up to 20%, but if you are producing these hydrocarbons, these are nothing but fuels. They are hydrocarbon, because your petrol and diesel are hydrocarbon. If you're able to produce through microbe these hydrocarbon, you can simply just add it into the vehicle without any problem. So it's very important to keep protecting your IPs, because that's how you can attract companies. They will trust you that you have a certain innovation. You're not having a problem of freedom to operate. So there's basically we file IPs. This is an example where US patent has been granted on some of our IPs. We have a lot of Indian patents also granted on some of these IPs. So yeah, there's a very good team which support at ICGB New Delhi, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I believe we have another panelist who is waiting on Zoom. Yeah. Gentlemen, IT. Do we have Dr. Yemi on Ankulne? Yeah. So, okay, we'll wait for him. So it's a pleasure to welcome, I think, our final panelist, who also has, she's the executive director of VLP Biotech in the US. Yemi, can you hear us?
Hello.
Yeah. Sorry for that. We were not actually, there was a little bit of a mishap in trying to actually put you on. Sorry for waiting for that long. But
no problem.
Yeah, if you could say a little bit about a bit of background about yourself as well. I'm not sure if you prepared a short presentation or not. Did you?
Yes, I can say a short background of myself, and I have a couple of slides. Basically, I was going to talk about addressing some of the challenges around vaccine platforms.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I can just introduce myself. My name is Yemi Onokunle. and I'm currently a board member of a vaccine development company based in San Diego. But I've come from a traditional biomanufacturing background, having been chief business officer at a company called Selexis in Switzerland.
I
I
know them.
also co-founded an immunotherapy company here in the US, developing switchable antibodies. My main interest actually in participating here, and this is following up from the discussions that we had last year at BioAfrica, was really to start engaging on how can we start to foster collaborative partnerships between the West and Africa to address some of the, I guess, uh, capacity requirements for vaccine production on the continent, recognizing just based on some of the discussions that we've heard already during this panel, that there are quite a number of resource requirements, especially human resource, as well as technology requirements in order to be able to address some of these challenges going forward. Now, I did prepare some slides, but I'm not sure it would be appropriate because I know we are running short on time. But some things I would like to highlight and just for us to keep in mind is firstly, the requirement, and I think the pandemic that we've just experienced really showed us that we do have to build a homegrown solution to pharmaceutical requirements and healthcare requirements on the continent. And there is a lot of interest now in the West to see how, especially with the diaspora in the West, to see how can we foster a framework that allows us to start to share our intellectual capital here in a way that will be beneficial in support of the efforts on the continent. And one of those ways is what I'm trying to do with my involvement with VLP Biotech, whereby we've established a vaccine company. It's been validated through a lot of NIH grants here in the US to develop vaccines that address infectious diseases that are endemic. So these are endemic diseases for Africa, which are ready for tech transfer, of course, to run through clinical trials. But importantly, helps us to then build as part of the tech transfer process, some of the intellectual capital requirements in order to be able to deploy those in a way that would then be suitable for other applications, either for going after pandemic type uh, uh, diseases or even some of the chronic diseases that are impacting mostly in the West. So I really see a potential for win-win partnership here. There is very strong interest here also with there's very strong interest here to really think about low-cost tech transfer that will allow these things to happen. And you know, I'll probably leave it there. I'm not sure if there's going to be a panel discussion to ask questions, but I'm happy to stay on to address any questions that may arise from these initiatives that I've just described.
Thank you, Yemi. Yes, please do wait on the wings. There might be questions that might be addressed to you, and indeed, it's a small world actually, because I know Selexis founder Igor Fish.
Yes,
From,
yes,
yeah,
we worked together for many years.
yeah. I think actually the session is supposed to end now at 2:15, so we've almost run out of time. But nevertheless, I think we'll open the floor for a few questions. Please go ahead. If maybe you could briefly state your name and institutional affiliation. Yeah. After, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Vuyo Jegula from MSD, responsible for Sub-Sahara market access as well as policy and government affairs. So my question is not, I think it's targeted towards maybe Godfrey as well as Swasti, and thank you very much for the presentations. And I was just reflecting on the Health Master Plan and some of the principles that were communicated, state-led, reciprocity in particular. And I think one of the comments I'd like to make is, I think whenever we think about master plans or strategies to promote industrial development, it's really important that we get to understand and articulate what South Africa's value proposition actually is, because I think that's the basis of reciprocity. So if I think about the industry that I'm a part of, which is innovative pharmaceuticals, in general, and I haven't done this maths in a while, but South Africa represents, I think, less than 1% of the global market. And I think the biggest value proposition for any pharmaceutical, be it local or international, is the ability to access markets at scale. And if we consider what that looks like, if we're talking private, many of our companies are at this moment servicing primarily the top 2 to 4%, even of the private market, representative of about 10 million insured lives. Expanding access even within that insured population beyond that 2 to 4% could mean a growth in market access of close to 80%. When we talk about public, which services about 86% of the population, or 84% of the population, that becomes something compelling as well. But in order to expand market access or access to markets or the size of markets in private, there are some key legislative reform efforts that need to be made, particularly in the area of pricing. And if you talk about public, then it's got to do with procurement policies. But then, even if you look at South Africa, and if we were to change all these sort of legislative barriers, perhaps, and present the entire population as a potential market, you're still talking 60 million people. And that's where you have to get, where regional integration really becomes a critical factor. Now, all of these things, in my view, are within the ambit and control of government and require policy coherence, where you have DTIC working closely with health, for example, if you're looking at devices as well as pharmaceuticals, working closely with other government agencies, even internationally, to really cement the question of regional integration, to create value chains and sizable markets that can attract local manufacturing and significant investment to achieve the master plan. These things are in the control of government. I think that's what I'm saying. And I think that is what presents reciprocity that can shift the needle to really incentivize industry. And I think these are things that are of relevance not only to international pharmaceuticals or companies, but even local ones. You mentioned, as an example, Aspen and Biovac. And local doesn't always mean cheap. But if you look at PFMA and procurement policies, you can only get or buy the cheapest product. And that means that we often undermine our own industrial development efforts. So I think I just wanted to make a comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question is directed at Dr. Onakunle, if he's still here, and perhaps Shams. I think over the past 2 days, we've been hearing a lot of discussions about discovery science, and I think part of the pricing model that is being pushed is around the premium that is put on innovation by research-intensive companies. Now, in order for the continent to achieve its health and food security, and even fuel security, we have to think more about the production technologies, the technology platforms that are going to massify the output. There's no point in having any discussion if you have innovative stuff that you cannot produce in sufficient amounts. Whether you're looking at it from an architectural innovation or just straight line in terms of component innovation, the production technologies, the technology platform that allows large bioreactors, biomass to be produced. And I just want to get a sense or some comment on what strategies that can we look at as a continent on the vaccine side that Yemi was speaking about, and maybe Shams was speaking about biofuels.
Just to follow up.
I'm happy to say a few words.
Just to follow up from Somi, like more technical question to Shams about the biofuel policy in India. What is the realistic percentage of by 2025, 20%? How much of it in terms of technology can we attribute to first generation bioethanol and second generation bioethanol?
Okay, is Yemi still there?
I'm still here, and I'm happy to say a few words on the vaccine side, and then I can, pass over. Yes, and I think that's a really fundamental question, because the challenge we have today is, at least in vaccine technology, it's a very fast and evolving field. Now, it's fast and evolving. The pathogens themselves are becoming more virulent, but the mechanisms for vaccinology, I think, we're seeing fundamental shifts in terms of the delivery and the core basis of the vaccines. So as you probably would be aware, traditionally vaccines have been where you take you take actually the organism itself, you weaken it or you kill it and deliver it to the patient. And first and foremost, that's always been a challenge because one, there's never really been a very safe way to ensure that you've killed the pathogen that you're delivering. So in some cases, whilst you're trying to grow these pathogens to weaken them before giving to the patient, you can actually be injecting them with an infectious agent that could become problematic. So we've shifted away from that. We've shifted away from whole organisms to using fragments of those organisms. And some of those fragments we are hoping can generate an immune response. But the challenge there is actually there's a real organized array of how these fragments have to be presented to the immune system before you can trigger an immune response. So you're really caught between a rock and a hard place. Do you go for the whole organism or do you go for fragments of the organisms? And that's why we believe, and we've seen recently the advent of what we call VLP, so virus-like particles, such that, if you look at things like hepatitis B, for instance, this is based on a virus-like particle, where you actually take an ordered array of the virus, so either the surface antigen or the core antigen, and then you can either modify that to present other types of pathogens or fragments, which the immune system then sees as foreign to the body and therefore generates an immune response. It so happens that these virus-like particles are quite amenable to manufacturing technologies that are existing today. And I think some of the organizations in South Africa and other parts of Africa may already be advanced in these technologies. For instance, fermentation, E. coli. E. coli production for the platform that we are working on I think it's one of the most generalized, scalable technologies today for production of biopharmaceuticals. There's so many different recombinant proteins and that have been already produced in E. coli, and we can extend that to produce some of these VLP platforms, which then means if we can have this capacity already established, gives us a basis for scalability whenever we have more pressing pandemic-like diseases to handle. And I really position E. coli-based production platforms relative to some of the newer technology platforms based on mRNA which, as you can imagine with mRNA, the challenge we had, especially in the last pandemic, was not only do you have to scale, which you have a limited scale that you can go to, you also have a cold chain, which makes it difficult to distribute your vaccines throughout Africa. With VLPs, you can have very stable vaccines, even at room temperature. In fact, for our platform, we not only are able to heat these VLPs up to 60 degrees, they remain stable for a very long time. So I think we should pay attention to these types of technologies that are more suited to deployment on the African continent. And I'll rest it there, but definitely happy to explore that further in subsequent discussions.
Thank you. Let me take the first question from Swami. So I think manufacturing capability is very important, and I can just take you some of the examples of how India went through. So, of course, the second generation biofuel, especially, it's not as simple. It's a bit of complex scenario as compared to the first generation biofuel. So, but in both cases, what you really look at is overlapping expertise of the industry. So, for example, the three industries that will have an overlapping expertise may not have an end-to-end technology, but will have an overlapping expertise. For example, your sugarcane industry, your paper and pulp mill industries, and your breweries industries. So they will have one or other component of the end-to-end technologies already in place. So they will know, or rather a know-how, of how to produce the fuel at a larger scale, provided if there are certain missing components are being placed already. Now, how that missing components are placed, why industry is not coming up to put up that missing component? Is this that government incentive is not there? Are they worried that if they produce ethanol, it will be wasted? Are they worried that, their cost will not be recovered? So those are the things that will have to come, or support will have to come from the governments. But I think the manufacturing capability will not come in one day. So for example, in India, they actually started with the pilot plant. So they called for proposal that can you set up a pilot plant, and this is what has happened in the last 10 years. For second generation biofuels, several pilot plants were established and demonstrated, showing that, well, at a certain scale, there are capabilities now there. Now all the techno-economic analysis and life cycle analysis has been well understood at that pilot plant level, and the cost is well accounted for. Now can we go for a manufacturing plant? So these are the step-by-step ways we'll have to go for, but I'm sure the capabilities of the existing industries can be accounted for kind of extending their capabilities further in the fuel range. Now coming to Vittoria's question on how India is achieving these targets. So obviously the 10% blending target that it has achieved just a few months ago has mainly come from molasses, which are a waste from the sugarcane industry. It's really a first generation because there are free sugars available in the molasses. And the grains which are wasted due to the climates, and they are opened, and so their waste grain cannot be used for the consumption purpose. So those are the feedstock that has been used so far for the 10%. But going from 10% to 20% would not be good enough for the first generation biofuel. It has to come from the second generation biofuel, and therefore the government is incentivizing those $2 billion that I showed is going to be invested in building up the capacity for the second generation biofuel. And that's how I believe we will achieve that target. Thank you very much.
Yes. Oops. Unfortunately, we've run over our allocated time, so I know there would be more questions and discussions. So on that note, I would like to thank you for your patience and your participation to this session.
Thank you.